Okay, I think we're good to go. So we come to chapter three in Daniel, and to start off, we'll just read the first portion of it, verses 1 through 7. So Daniel 3, verses 1 through 7. And it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so the Lord will add his own blessing to the reading of his word. So we come into this chapter, and you may remember as we have moved through some of what we've looked at, we talked about the chiastic structure of a portion of Daniel. That is, there is a corresponding chapter later on that matches the chapter that you're in. So when we were in chapter 2, the chapter that corresponded to that was chapter 7. And now we have moved into chapter 3, and the corresponding chapter is chapter 6. And so in both of these instances, we have the deliverance of the Lord's people by the Lord. And so in this chapter, we're going to see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and being delivered. And then in chapter 6, we see Daniel being delivered from the lion's den. And so just that note that chapter 3 and chapter 6 correspond with each other. And then as we come into this chapter, we have left a chapter in which the king has learned that the God of heaven is omniscient. For instance, back in chapter 2:47, you'll remember Nebuchadnezzar's response to Daniel. He says, The king answered Daniel and said, Of a truth it is, that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing that you could reveal the secret. So the idea is that God, Daniel's God, was omniscient. He knows all, and therefore he could tell Daniel not only what the king's dream was, but also the interpretation of that dream. And now as we move into this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is going to learn that Daniel's God and the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is omnipotent. And so in chapter 3 and verse 28, we have a response from Nebuchadnezzar again. And it says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. And so Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges the power of God, that God himself is omnipotent. And so he's learning bit by bit as he goes along. Now, I guess in a sense, from both chapters 3 and 6, we have this lesson that God delivers his people who put their trust in him. Now, it's not always in the way that his people would expect. For instance, we'll see that the three Hebrews, they say, our God will deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still going to trust him. And so, you would think that when we're in a situation, that God would deliver you out of the situation before it gets too difficult. But God doesn't do that in this particular instance. He's going to demonstrate his power in an even greater way. And so when we come to these two chapters, both of Daniel's delivery from the lion's den and the three Hebrew men being delivered from the fiery furnace, we see God delivering them in the midst of the trouble and in the difficulty. And so these are encouragements. First of all, there'll be encouragements to the Hebrews, to the Jewish people. Why? Because we're going to see that in Nebuchadnezzar, in setting up this image that he sets up in chapter 3, it's sort of like a precursor for what the Antichrist will do in the time of the tribulation, when he establishes an image of himself halfway through the tribulation and demands that the world worship him. And here we have, if you like, a precursor to that, where Nebuchadnezzar sets up an image and is going to demand that the world of his day worship that image. And of course, in both situations, we have a situation where the one in charge has total rule. He's a totalitarian, if you like. He has absolute rule. Antichrist at the time will have absolute rule in the time of the tribulation. And so we see these similar characteristics between what we're going to see in chapter 3 and then eventually even future to us, the Antichrist requiring worship of himself. Now, when we come to this, we're going to see that these men are put in a position where, once again, they have to make a choice. They have to make the choice to either stand for God and stand for that which is right, regardless of the circumstances, just as they had to do before. You'll remember when they came before Nebuchadnezzar, came before to the attention of the king back in chapter 1. And so and also in chapter 2, where they were involved in the prayer, seeking the Lord for the answer that Daniel would give to Nebuchadnezzar. And so we have these very real tests that come. And I think it's true that with regard to believers, there will be tests that come in our lives. It might be a very simple test where we suddenly find ourselves in a position, perhaps in an employment place, perhaps with neighbors, whatever it may be, and all of a sudden the circumstances coalesce so that really we have to make a decision. Are we going to speak for the Lord? Are we going to stand for the Lord? Or are we not? And so again, as we approach this book and its lessons, it is teaching us again how to stand for the Lord in the midst of a situation and circumstances that are against the Lord, where there is not necessarily a favorable attitude towards Christian things in our situation, and for the Jews, no favorable attitude towards the God of Israel or the temple in Jerusalem. And so we find that in our lives, God allows those who would testify for him to be tested. And of course, those tests are from the Lord to develop our faith, to develop us in strength of faith, and to enable us to stand for him and grow for him and grow in him. Of course, James talks about this in James chapter 1. James says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." The King James says divers temptations, but the idea is trials. "Knowing this, that the trial of your faith works patience," or develops patience. "And let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that gives to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him." And so this is, again, in Daniel, an illustration of what James is talking about when we stand for the Lord, that these trials or tests will come, and they are designed not to make us fail, but to enable us to stand and to increase our resilience in the Christian life, to stand for the Lord. You know, engineers devise tests for what they're building. Maybe it's a certain metal that they plan to use in the construction, say, of a building or of some machine, and they want to use that metal, but they have some questions about its capability of standing up under the pressures that they know it's going to have to endure. And so they devise tests of that metal. And the purpose of the test is in the hope that it will pass the test. It is not in the hope that it will fail. Now, if it fails, obviously they have to go back to the drawing board. But the test in the first place is to prove its resilience and its capability for the job. And when it comes to us as believers and the tests that the Lord brings along, I would suggest it's the same thing. It is, the Lord does not test us with the expectation that we will fail. Obviously, he is there to forgive and to pick us up again if we do fail. But his testing is with the expectation that we would pass the test. And so when Paul writes to Timothy, Paul says those who stand for the Lord, they will suffer persecution. And so this is something to be expected in the Christian life. And the illustrations that we have of dealing with the issue, we find in this book of Daniel, looking at Daniel and his three friends and in the circumstances that both of them end up in. And so we see these tests, and we see the absolute confidence that these men in chapter 3 have in their God, and we see the absolute confidence that Daniel has in chapter 6 in his God. And so it's going to come from this image that is set up in what's called the plain of Dura. Now, when we see in verse 1, we see what Nebuchadnezzar designs. And so it is an image of gold, and the height of it is 80 cubits, and the breadth 6 cubits. Now, a cubit, the normal cubit, is about 18 inches. There's a couple of variations on that. One would be bigger, and the variations are larger than 18 inches, but 18 inches is a normal cubit. And if you take that then as the measurement, 60 cubits, which is 60, is 90 feet. So we have this image that's 90 feet high. And as well as that, it's 6 cubits wide, which is 9 feet. And so we have this massive image, and we're not told that it is an image of a man, but I think that's the emphasis here, because I would suggest that Nebuchadnezzar has got the idea of the image from Daniel's interpretation of his dream, of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where there's the image of a man. And of course, you'll remember that the interpretation was that Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom were the head of gold on that image. And I would suggest that what we're seeing here again is an image of a man that Nebuchadnezzar is setting up. We're going to find out that it is an image of gold. Now, it doesn't mean that it was necessarily pure gold, but it would have been gold covered. And we see this in various places in the scriptures. We find something that's called by the name of the metal, but it's actually metal that is overlaid over wood. So for instance, when there was the development of the tabernacle, we hear about the brazen altar. Well, that makes it sound as though it's made of bronze. And it was made of bronze, but it was bronze overlaid over wood. And when you get into Isaiah and Jeremiah, you find, again, references to things that are made of wood, and then they are overlaid with a metal. It might be gold or something else. And so it suggests that an image of this height is the actual amount of gold, if it was to be made of pure gold, was so phenomenal that it's unlikely that it would have been made of pure gold. So it was most likely an image made of wood, and then it was covered over with gold. And so it just looked as a gold image. Now, the idea of being a gold image is Nebuchadnezzar maybe taking it a little further than what he saw in his dream, because you'll remember that as you got below the head of gold in the man in his image, or in his vision or in his dream, that then the chest and the arms were of silver. But here, Nebuchadnezzar, it's almost as though he's not remembering the rest of what God said. God said in the interpretation of the dream, your kingdom's going to pass away, and it'll become the silver kingdom. But Nebuchadnezzar appears to be setting up this gold image, perhaps with the idea, well, regardless of what God has said, my kingdom is going to endure and it's going to go on forever, etc. So a little bit of arrogance on his part, perhaps, but certainly his image is set up there. Now, they tell us that to be able to have an image of that height and all of the things that would be required to have that image stand upright, that it would have to stand on a base. And it's interesting because we have the location given to us, and the location is the plain of Dura. And so this is in verse 1, it's set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so it's fairly close to Babylon, the city, but it's about 12 miles southeast, we think. And the reason that we think that is because of an archaeological find. The actual location of the plain of Dura was not really known, but a good number of years ago, there was an archaeological expedition to a place that had within its name this idea of Dura. And so they excavated there, and they actually found like a platform built that would have supported an image of this height. And so they suspect that they have the actual location of where Nebuchadnezzar set up this great image that he was going to require people to bow down to. And so in that place, they found this plinth, or this platform that was about 20 to 30 feet high. And as well as that, there were sides to it that were about 45 feet long. So it was almost as though it was a channel that channeled people's attention right to this platform with the statue on it. Now, again, if you think of a platform about 20 feet high and then a statue of 90 feet high, you're looking something that is pretty tall, that would be seen from a long way around. And we have this situation on a plain where many people could be brought together. And the estimates, and they regard these as low estimates, estimate that when this occasion happened, that there was probably about 300,000 people there who were expected to bow to the statue, as we read through those first 7 verses. And now in these verses, we see this continued emphasis, and the emphasis is this. It is the repetition of Nebuchadnezzar set it up. And so in verse 1, it says, he set it up. In verse 2, right at the end of the verse, it says, the king had set up. In verse 3, it says it twice. Almost at the end, it says that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and then they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then when you get into verse 5, again at the end of the verse, it talks about the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And in verse 7 at the end of the verse, the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And if you jump down to verse 12, again, the golden image which thou hast set up. And in verse 14, why do you not worship the golden image that I have set up? In verse 15 in the King James, it's the same words, but it talks about you fall down and worship the image that I have made. Again, it's the same phrase, set up. And then just one more in verse 18, we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so it seems to be emphasizing very much that this is a product of Nebuchadnezzar's ego, a product of Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, a product in which he was very vitally involved in its development and in its creation and in its being established there on the plain of Dura. And I think that emphasis is given because it's going to be contrasted with the fact that God demonstrates once again that regardless of the power and the might of any human being and any human king, that God is greater, that despite the arrogance and the powerfulness of this man Nebuchadnezzar in his day, where he ruled the world of his day, yet God is greater still, and man can set up whatever he likes, which is in opposition to God, but God will always come out, if you like, on top, and God is supreme and sovereign. And so that emphasis in those first 18 verses of Nebuchadnezzar setting up it's interesting how the Spirit of God repeats things. In fact, as we read through, you'll notice that he repeated the list of the officials. And so in verse 2, he starts off talking about the princes, the princes, the governors, the captains, etc. In verse 3, it is repeated again, the princes, the governors, the captains, etc. And then, as well as that, when it comes to the musical instruments that are talked about, again, those are repeated. There's an emphasis on the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's pulling together all of the a demonstration of all of the power of his kingdom. We see 8 different groups of officials that are mentioned. We see 6 specific instruments, and then it talks about it just lumps a whole bunch of instruments together. And it's this idea of this great orchestra, and it all lends an air of solemnity and an air of importance to the whole thing. I guess as I read through this, I thought in terms of, you watch the Olympics and they have their opening ceremonies, and they have all the music and all the athletes coming, etc. And it's to give this great impression of the greatness of the occasion. And so here we have Nebuchadnezzar doing exactly the same thing. And he has this orchestra out where, again, with regard to the instruments in verse 5, talks about the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and then it's all wrapped up together, all kinds of music. And so he brings together this great assemblage of people with the ceremony being bathed in the music. And it is all to give the impression of the greatness of himself and of his kingdom, as the people are brought together to bow down to this great image. And so we have in verses 1 to 3 really the setup or the dedication of the image. That's what they're there for. In verse 2, it says that they were to come to the dedication of the image. Now we're familiar with dedications. For instance, perhaps a new chapel building is built, and the people who are going to use it, they come together to dedicate it to the use of the Lord for the extension of the gospel, etc. And so we're familiar with that. And Nebuchadnezzar is doing exactly the same thing. He's dedicating this image. And I think it's meant to stand as a permanent reminder to all around, to the whole world, of his power and the power of his kingdom, that he is supreme in all the world. Now, the question is, why would he do this? Apart from ego and arrogance, why would he bother to do this? And the suggestion is, and it's not something that we see in scripture, but it comes from the history of the times, the secular history of the times. In fact, it's in what's called the Babylonian Chronicles. And the Babylonian Chronicles are like a history that was maintained at the time. It would be like in our day, the archives. If you go to Ottawa, there's the archive building, and in that building is maintained all the documentation and all the things that are relevant to the history of the nation and of the government. And so it's kept there. And the same was true of these ancient empires. They maintained very detailed information about the history. In fact, you see that in the book of Ezra, because when Ezra are in the first couple of returns, First of all, the return under, trying to remember his name, I've forgotten his name, but also Zerubbabel, that's the name I was thinking of. Zerubbabel and also the high priest, Joshua the high priest, as they led the first group back from Babylon to rebuild the temple. And then later when Ezra was there, we find that them coming back to the land of Israel was opposed by a variety of groups. One of those groups is what became the Samaritans. And then in their opposition to the Jews coming back, they wrote to the king to say, you know, this bunch of ragtag Jews, they're coming, they're not going to pay you taxes, and they're going to build a place, and it'll be fortified, and they're just going to do everything against your interests, king. And so the king stopped gave a command to stop the rebuilding of the temple. And later on, when Ezra came and when Haggai and Zechariah came on the scene, they restarted the building of the temple. And again, they were opposed, and letters were written to the king. And the king commanded that the archives should be consulted because this time the Jews had written back and they said, we were given the command under Cyrus to come back and to rebuild this place. This is in your history. And so go back and consult those records and you'll find out that we are doing that which we've been permitted and commanded to do. And so these records were kept very detailed. And in the Babylonian Chronicles, we find that during Nebuchadnezzar's reign in about 585, that there was an attempted revolt against him. And so the suggestion is that what he is doing is devising a way to ensure that all the people in his empire are loyal to him. And what he's actually doing here is really instituting an oath of loyalty to him in the face of an attempted coup against him. Now, the attempted coup, we're told from the Chronicles, was actually by the son of Belshazzar. Now, of course, we see Belshazzar or Belshazzar later in the book, but this attempted coup at the time was supposedly led by Belshazzar's son. And so whether this is the occasion or not, we do not know. There's some other commentators who think it's only a short time after the events of chapter 2, which would put it in about 601. And so you see there's a difference of opinion as to when this happened. So whatever the motivation was, whether it was simply because of arrogance and ego, after thinking about the interpretation of the dream of chapter 2, or whether it is in response to an attempted coup, one way or another, what we're seeing here on the plain of Dura is really an oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to ensure that these people know that he is boss. He's a totalitarian king. He may be beneficent at times, but he wants them to know that he's the one in charge. And so that's really what we're seeing here, this oath of loyalty to the king. And so as we think about this a little bit more, we see here that he talks about anybody who does not comply with his instruction to bow down to this image when the music begins, that there is a penalty for that, and that penalty is to be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace, as we see in verse 6. Now, it's interesting because we find in another occasion that being burned is something that happened. We don't see a lot of it in the Old Testament, but we do see instances of it. For instance, if we go to Jeremiah chapter 29 and in verse 22, we see in this chapter, it is talking about being in Babylon. It's talking about the Jews who were taken into Babylon. And in Jeremiah 29 and verse 10, for instance, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years are accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place." And so here we have Jeremiah's prophecy. And this is the prophecy that we will see Daniel reading later in the book of Daniel. And from Jeremiah's prophecy, Daniel becomes aware that the people will be released from Babylon to go back to Israel, that God has already said that would happen. But in the same chapter, down in verse 22, we see the disposition of some of the kings of Judah. It says, we'll start in verse 21. It says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, of Ahab, the son of Kolaiah, and Zedekiah, the son of Messiah, which prophesy a lie unto you in my name. Behold, I will deliver them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he shall slay them before your eyes. And of them shall be taken up a curse by all the captivity of Judah, which are in Babylon, saying, The Lord make thee like Zedekiah and like Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire." And so here we have again Nebuchadnezzar being talked about, and on another occasion, he has roasted Zedekiah, who is the last king of Judah, and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. So Ahab was an earlier king, but Nebuchadnezzar has roasted them in the fire. So this penalty that he sets out for those who refuse to bow down to the image is not an unheard of thing. This seems to have been something that was used at times as a punishment for the king's enemies. It's interesting because if we think in terms of the New Testament, we see in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28 the words of the Lord Jesus. And the words of the Lord Jesus are this: "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And that's what we're going to see with the three Hebrew men. This is the lesson. This is a lesson that they are actually illustrating way back in their time before the Lord Jesus ever teaches this. When he came to the earth, fear not those that are able to kill the body. And really that's the situation that we have when it comes to what we're going to see in the rest of chapter 3. And just along those sorts of lines, thinking along those lines, in Hebrews 10 and verse 31, it says, "It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." And when we think in those terms, we realize that God often acts by way of fire. You'll remember in some of the judgments that he brought in the Old Testament, it was by way of fire. When we come to the tribulation in the future, there will be much that is burned up by way of fire. In Hebrews 12 and verse 29, it says, our God is a consuming fire. And in Hebrews 11, verse 34, and of course, Hebrews 11 is what we call the chapter that outlines the heroes of faith. But in verse 34, it talks about those who quenched the violence of fire. Some of these that the writer to the Hebrews sets out as those who stood for God. It's right in the middle of this whole passage that details and outlines those who stood by faith. And so in verse 33, it talks about those who, through faith, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, and then quenched the violence of fire. And I suspect that perhaps the writer had in mind these Hebrew young men who had been elevated to be leaders in Babylon, and yet now were being put in a, if you like, an impossible situation where they could not comply with the command or the wishes of the king that they served, but rather they were going to comply with the wishes and the commands of the king who was the greater king, their God, Jehovah. And so when we think about, before we move on from those verses, if we think about these officials from the empire, remember that the empire spread out all over the known world and extended out to India. That is the sort of Western and Middle Eastern world. We don't really see much of India in the scriptures or beyond that, but certainly in the what was regarded as the known world at the time, we have this kingdom that is spread out all across various countries. And so Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was made up of various countries that had been conquered. It was made up of various cultures. It was made up of people of various, not only cultural background, but also of language background. And so, again, it talks about this in these verses. For instance, in verse 4, it says, O people, nations, and languages. And so Nebuchadnezzar was seeking to maintain peace within this sprawling empire that had all of these different ideas and thinking within it, because the people were from all different backgrounds and different cultures and different languages. And so he needed to do something that would enforce a unity within the kingdom. And so these classes of leaders, we see them starting with the princes, and some folks, some commentators have defined or tried to define and give an explanation of what these officials are. And so they say that the princes were really the administrators of the empire. And so the empire was divided into provinces, just like Canada. And so the princes would have been like the premiers of the provinces, of our provinces. They were the administrators of the empire. They were the direct royal representatives. So they were, if you like, the top guys. Now, in a sense, there are those above that, because in chapter 2, we have already seen the Chaldeans, chapters 1 and 2. And the Chaldeans were those who were the same background as Nebuchadnezzar himself. Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean. And so around him, his chief advisors are Chaldeans. They are native Babylonians. And of course, they're the top ranking advisors to the king, of which Daniel became one also, even though he wasn't originally from Babylon. But the princes were likely either appointed by Nebuchadnezzar from the peoples in the various provinces where they governed, or else they were men that were sent from Babylon to be the princes or the administrators of those provinces. And then the second level is the governors. And the suggestion is that they were the military chiefs in those provinces. And so they would be responsible to the princes. And then the captains, and they were regarded as really the chief people in the civil government, almost like our civil service. And you get those that are deputy ministers in Canadian terms. The deputy minister is a civil servant. The minister, of course, is a politician in our system. And this would have been similar to the Babylonian system, where the governors, the commanders, the military leaders under the princes, then you get the, if you like, the civilian counterparts to the military, and they are the presidents or the governors of the civil government. And then you get the judges, and they were like advisors or counselors to the princes. And then you have the treasurers. Obviously, that's self-explanatory. That's maybe like the treasury chief that we have in Ottawa of the Canadian Treasury. And they looked after the money. And then we have the counselors, who were they were lawyers, and so they took care of the law of the empire. And then the sheriffs were the ones who executed the law. So the counselors were like lawyers who guarded the law, and then the sheriffs executed the law. So it'd be like almost like the police, where you go out to uphold the law. And then it talks, that's seven, a list of seven. And then in verse 2 and also in verse 3, it is followed up with the idea of others that kind of more minor functionaries, that were there in the provinces. You'll notice in verse 2 that after sheriffs it says all the rulers of the provinces. And perhaps this is the group that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fit into, because you'll remember that when Daniel was appointed over the province of Babylon, that then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were appointed as administrators under him. And so I think perhaps they are summed up in this category of rulers of the provinces. And so they are expected to be here on the plain of Dura because they're included in this whole list of the various officials from the empire. Then the instruments, again, just more by way of interest a little bit. The cornet, of course, is generally accepted to be some sort of horn, like a trumpet or that sort of thing. The flute, it comes from a verb that means to hiss or to whistle, and so probably made from reeds, and probably like our flutes of today that you get in an orchestra or a fife. Then the harp, which is also called a lyre, L-Y-R-E, be a stringed instrument, and generally these instruments had somewhere between 3 and 12 strings, depending on what type it was. And then the sackbut, which is a a word that is totally foreign to us. But again, like another lyre or stringed instrument, except this time it's a rectangular shape and it just has 4 strings. And then a psaltery. In this case, again, there's strings, but they're stretched out over drum-like material so that it resonates. The sound of the strings resonate from the drum. And then the dulcimer. Now today we have dulcimers. We see people that play dulcimers. Again, it's a stringed instrument in our day, and they play it by hitting the strings with little spoons. But here the word actually has more to do with being a wind instrument. And in one or two translations of the scriptures, it's translated bagpipes. And so I don't know if that's where the Scots got the bagpipes from, but you can see there's all this different type of music. This is literally the empire's orchestra that is there to give this sense of occasion to this whole thing that's going on in the plain of Dura. And so as we see this happening, we see, first of all, the statue that's set up. We see Nebuchadnezzar's purpose in it, suggesting again this idea of an oath of loyalty. We see the magnificence of the situation. And again, it's befitting a king or an emperor of his empire. And we see the test that is included in it, a test for those who would oppose the whole thing. It's not a test for those who are in compliance. They simply go along with it all. And we see that they are asked to bow down and worship in verse 6. And so the suggestion of some is that it's not so much worshiping the image itself, but worshiping what is behind it. That is the empire, worshiping the emperor and the empire. Because you'll remember it's the idea of the gods of the empire. You'll remember that the concept in that day was, if my God is better than your God, then I get the victory. And so it's this idea of bowing down to the empire and really the gods behind the empire. It's the gods that have made this empire great. It's the gods that have allowed the empire to extend so far across the world. It's the gods who have put Nebuchadnezzar in place, and his gods in particular, the gods of Babylon, because it's very evident that he has conquered the world, and he has conquered, specifically, he has conquered Israel, and therefore the gods of Babylon are obviously stronger and better than the God of Israel. Now, he's already learned this lesson before, where he saw the omniscience of God. And as we emphasized then, he hadn't at that time submitted to the God of Israel. As we saw it at the end of chapter 2, where he recognized the God of Israel and he acknowledged the God of Israel, yet he wasn't yet a believer in the God of Israel. And so time has passed, and the dominance of his natural thinking about his own gods and about his own value and his own importance, they have predominated. And if you like, I would suggest that perhaps he has forgotten the lesson that he learned when Daniel interpreted or gave him his dream and interpreted his dream. And so we do that too, don't we? We learn a lesson and then we go on from it, and practically we forget the lesson again and have to be reminded again. And so Nebuchadnezzar is going to be reminded again in a very forceful way in the situation of these three Hebrew men. And so this is what is being set up here, the circumstance in which these three men are going to find themselves. It is a circumstance in which they are being asked to bow down and worship not only the empire and the emperor, but the gods that are behind the empire and the emperor. And so it becomes a very obvious test for these men. And the question is, what are they going to do about it? And so we see in verse 7 that when the orchestra strikes up the music, it says, all kinds all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so we have this circumstance set up, and we're going to leave it there for tonight. And next time we'll come back and we'll think in detail about the three men who refused to worship the gods of Babylon. And we're going to see that God, again, as you know, demonstrates his power, his glory, his omnipotence in the face of this king who has taken to himself the magnificence and the power that he thinks he has gained because of his gods. And God, Jehovah, is going to make it very clear that his gods are no gods at all, and that Jehovah is the one sovereign and only God. And so what a time this was for these young men. And remember, they are still young men. Now, even if it's the 585 date when this happens, we suggested that Daniel and his friends were much the same age when they were captured in 605. And so if we're now down in 585, this is 20 years after they were captured. So they're still relatively young men, late 20s, perhaps very, very early 30s. If, as some others think, this was only right after chapter 2, which we saw was only 2 years after they got captured, then it's maybe within a year or two after that. So if it's that date, they're still in their very early 20s. And so these are young men who have come to know their God and have absolute confidence in their God. And whether they're still in their 20s or whether they're late 20s or early 30s, they still haven't changed. And we're going to see that they continue to stand for God. And may we do the same. So we'll end there, and I'll turn off the recording and we'll pray.